At the time of recording, we're about 2 weeks out from the US Open. Grand Slam betting compared to, just regular ATP WA Tour, besides the fact that it's obviously, bigger prize money, bigger prestige, what's the sort of the key differences that people should be looking for in terms of their tennis betting between the two?
I'll start with the ATP. I guess the key thing to keep in mind from an ATP perspective is that we're looking at best of 5 sets. So a lot of these players, and it's probably of more note this year with so many withdrawals, is that you're going to get a lot of players who haven't got a lot of best of 5 set experience. And if you look at, and if you think back through the number of times over the years that you've seen top players come back from, 2 sets to 1 down or 2 sets to love down, they can't do that anywhere else outside of, the Grand Slam. So, it does mean that, it's much easier to beat Novak Djokovic over 3 sets than it is over 5, because, he's basically got the fitness advantage over almost everyone. So I think that's one thing to consider. And I think also, because you are getting that bit of a mix of the top tier players and the players who are kind of pushing to that top tier through that 100 to 150 in the rankings, you do get a bit of a balance, and you need to consider, I guess, at both the men and the women, the pressure that can come with that as well. It's a lot of unfamiliar territory. It's a lot of money on the line. It's a lot of ranking points on the line. It's a lot different to, when I went down to Traralgon last year to watch the Challenger Tour. It's a little bit different, sitting at a Grand Slam going, right, this is, a win here could set up my next 2, 4, 6 months on the tour. And I think particularly this year, looking at players who, they're not needing to defend their points from 2019. So, players who probably performed more poorly last year. One off the top of my head, Dominic Thiem, who lost in the first round of the 2019 US Open. He's got this opportunity now he's basically got a free hit at trying to accumulate some points towards his ranking. So, looking at what they did last year as well, because, but with the new rules around rankings, it's going to be interesting to see where all these players fit at the end of the year with a modified year-end championships and ranking system.
Does the final set tiebreaker rule that's been implemented for like the 5-set tennis, has that changed your betting at all? Whereas, there's going to be a cap on how much they can play. You're not going to see a crazy sort of like a 5-set, Wimbledon battle like we had in the past where they go for ages. Has that changed your betting at all, knowing that there will be a cap on the time that they will be out on the court?
It doesn't change it a great deal. I guess looking back in previous years, and I mean, Roland Garros still has, you need to win by 2 games in the 5th set. It's one of those things that it's worth remembering, particularly if you've got a handicapped selection or something that's going into that final set, that there's another variable into that someone can only win it by 1. Now there is that potential for that to occur. It doesn't change a lot, because if they've got to that point, it's been a long match. Most things have covered or close to, and it's probably a matter of half a game here or there. But when you think about it over such a long game, it doesn't change things too much. If anything, it probably has just reduced the opportunities to, if someone's gone and played to 21-19 in the 5th set and has to back up the next day, you use the Mahut versus Isner from a couple, was it 10 years ago, that went to 70-68. John Isner had to play that afternoon, had to play 4 hours later in the next round, and I think he won 3 or 4 games. So it's more just finding those opportunities to perhaps oppose people coming off a long match. And I think that's probably going to be key this year as well, off such little competitive tennis coming into, 2 Grand Slams back to back.
Yeah. And I want to, just on opposing people, just with surfaces as well. So I'm right in saying that majority of the tour is hard court tennis tournaments. Is that right?
Hard court and clay. So they're probably the 2 that will chop and change through. The whole grass season for 2020 got wiped out. So it's trying to, and I think that's the thing I like about tennis and trying to figure out where the value is that you've got different surfaces. You've got, within those surfaces, you can have faster and slower versions. You can have, altitude playing a role. You can have temperature playing a role. It can be windy. You still get in an individual, one-on-one match, but there are a lot of variables that you need to consider. And, if you feel like you confidently know enough about players, then that's where you can find your advantage.
Do you find that you're more successful between ATP or WTA, or maybe there is a certain surface that you are more successful on betting wise?
Depends which year you ask me. It's kind of chopped and changed a little bit, I think, over the last couple of years. I've come to appreciate clay more probably over the last 3 or 4 years. I'm a fan of the grass court season just because it is so condensed and you can get a really good read on, players and being able to find, the value of a week on the grass at another tournament compared to someone flying in having played on clay. I have appreciated that in the last couple of years, but I think, that just a genuine, you look at the US Open, you look at the Australian Open, general hard court battle, you're going to get a fairly consistent showing that, that things shouldn't change too much outside of wind and how the surface is going to play. It's not as weather dependent perhaps in some instances, but look, as I've just gone through there's a lot of different variables to consider, but I think hard court is probably the one I enjoy watching the most, and it's probably the easiest to watch, particularly on, if you're watching streams or watching things that are a little bit smaller. It's a lot easier to see the ball than, some of those clay tournaments that are, when you're trying to get yourself set with a stream, you spend half the time watching the player instead of the ball because you have no idea where it is. So yeah, it can be challenging, but if I had to pick, I'd go hard court.
Yeah. I want to ask you just on reviewing a bet. So, in terms of, like racing punters, like they can watch a race over in a minute and a half, they can see multiple jockeys at once, horses, see what they're doing. If a tennis match goes for 3 hours, how are you reviewing a bet just in terms of, like unforced errors? The Australian Open, there's a heat factor, how many break points they might have had, unforced errors. If a player has like a Nick Kyrgios type blow up during the game, how do you go about reviewing your bets and in terms of whether you made the right play or the wrong play?
There's probably 2 different ways that I look at it. There's one that if I've watched the match, it's probably easier for me to take notes and to be able to review that whilst looking at, I think that they've done a great job in terms of having a lot of stats accessible, particularly in Grand Slams, but they're getting better with other tournaments as well. So you can get a bit of an idea around service percentage and, just using ones, for example, in the past, if you've opposed, say, a John Isner or someone that's, a big server. I think I opposed him against, I think it was Jordan Thompson, and it was on indoor hard court. That I think he lost in. It was a close game, and he just lost. But when you look through, I think Isner put 80-something% of his first serves into play, which is well above what his average would be. I think it's worth acknowledging and looking at those stats around kind of did they get a lot of first serves in? Did they generate a lot of break points and couldn't convert? Were there other reasons that they might have been fatigued or tired coming from other tournaments, or there are other things to consider? I have been a big believer and writer in terms of, and I will try in my previews to refer back to other previews or other matches that I've covered in the past, because I think, particularly those losing ones, I mean, once you stop looking at your mentions on Twitter after a loss, once you put that to the side, you learn more from those. You can, and then, it's probably the more rewarding part of it is to be able to go, yeah, this is what happened last match, and this is now why I'm making this decision, and this is why I think that this is value. And it is worth doing, particularly in tennis, because a lot of those top players will play each other again. And if you can make a comment as to why something happened on a particular day, and you've got that information there with you that you can use to your advantage over someone who's just gone back and looked and gone, oh, they lost 6-1, 6-1 to them 2 months ago. You've then got a piece of information that you can then utilize to your advantage, hopefully.
So you're looking at price history as well then? You say if a player plays each other again, a month down the track and the prices are the exact same, but it was still a close game, you're taking that into account as well?
Yeah, I think it's important because, and again, I can probably use an example from earlier this year as well, that, I was able to go up to Brisbane and watch Putin-Saver against Danielle Collins, and, I tipped Putin-Saver on that day, and I think she lost love and won, or won and love, or she didn't win very many games. And they were then scheduled to meet each other at the Australian Open a fortnight later. Yet Putin-Saver was at significantly higher odds because of what had happened in Brisbane, before you take into consideration the fact that the courts were slower in Melbourne, the temperature was colder, so it was harder for Collins to be able to hit through the court. And Collins was not playing as well at that point in time. She'd played a lot of tennis over the fortnight before, and Putin-Saver was able to flip the script and win at an even higher odds than she was, in the first meeting. So, I think it's important to acknowledge it, but, I think everyone has their own way and their own kind of stats and things to target, but there are so many factors. Don't get caught up in all of them, is probably my tip. Try and figure out what works for you. The beauty of tennis, as I said, is, there's some days there's hundreds of matches that you can have a go. You don't need to go into all 100. Just find what works for you and find the right spots, and then, work from there.
For the WA Tour, we've seen over the last couple of years that, Serena's dominance has certainly, gone down a bit as she's got a bit older and had a child as well. And we're seeing all these young guns come out of the woodwork, and, a different player is winning, a Grand Slam, all the time. But on the men's side, it's so heavily dominated by, Novak, Nadal, and, to a lesser extent, Federer now. Eventually, all of these guys are going to retire at some point. How do you expect the market to react to, all of these players basically exiting? Because every Australian Open, Novak's $2 to win before the tournament draw even comes out. Nadal's unbackable at every single French Open. They'll rename it after him, I'm sure. And all the young players that are coming through certainly have talent, but they aren't able to get near those top 3 players. When they all leave, how do you see the market reacting to that?
It's a good question. I'll start with the women's. I think with Serena, I think we're starting to see it. I think we're starting to see that start to even out at the top. And when you look at the players who are coming through, and, even though she's probably older than a lot of the other ones pushing through, you look at, the Kvitovas and Pliškovas, that they're, the bigger strikers, they're kind of in that prime now to be able to try and continue to push for Grand Slams. But you're seeing the younger players that come through, that they've got a different style to probably what we've seen over the last 10 years in particular, whereas in the past it's been, Halep and Kerber who've been able to kind of, grab some of those Grand Slams and be able to, counterpunch and get their way through. You're looking at, Osaka and Barty and Andreescu, who are able to kind of win points more on their own terms. And I think, we're going to see more players of that ilk. And, one to keep an eye on for the US Open is Elena Rybakina. There's these bigger strikers of the ball now that are starting to be able to go, well, you know what, if Serena's lost a step and all of a sudden things are opening up, that we're able to kind of take advantage of that and be a little bit more assertive. And they've done a great job of working on their mobility, so they're probably not as caught out as consistently, against the likes of Halep and Kerber. So it's a really interesting dynamic now that I think the WTA is currently at, which is probably where the ATP is going to be at I thought Federer was going to retire a couple of years ago, so I keep saying in a couple of years. But, once you start to look, and particularly because we've got, the best of 5 component of Grand Slams, we're seeing, Tsitsipas and Thiem and these guys, Medvedev, who are taking scalps of Nadal, Djokovic and Federer, in best of 3 format, but they're just not quite there at the best of 5. But once those 3 move on from tennis, there's going to be a big pool of these players who are quite match hardened, who will be able to take advantage of the next, say, 5 to 10 years. And from a Australian standpoint, you look at Demonor, for example, who's probably really well placed to be able to really push to the top of the tennis tour once these 3 kind of start to drop down the rankings and retire, because, in a similar way that Leighton Hewitt was able to kind of, I don't want to say snatch a couple of Grand Slams, but he peaked his run in the tour absolutely perfectly to get in before Federer and after that kind of Agassi, Sampras and grab a couple. So yeah, I think that's probably, it's going to be quite balanced, but I think it's going to be great to see what, where Tsitsipas, Team, Medvedev, they're all suited to they're all able to play on all surfaces quite well, that we're going to see a lot of even odds. And, it's probably going to come down, draws are going to present maybe with a bit more value instead of just trying to figure out who, is on the other side to Djokovic half the time. There's probably going to be more consistent value around quarters and from a trading standpoint, instead of trying to figure out, is Djokovic going to win or is he going to retire?
Yeah. Do you have a clear greatest of all time out of those 3, Djokovic, Nadal and Federer?
Oh, only those 3. I was going to say Margaret Court. It really comes down to what your definition of greatest of all time is. Is it, if you're looking at, Nadal, I don't think Nadal's feats on clay will ever be matched. I would be incredibly shocked if they were. Aesthetically, in terms of watching, looking at Federer on grass, or Federer really anywhere, I think he's the best. He's been the best to watch, and watching him in full flight, back in his peak years, was possibly the best tennis I've seen. In terms of results and when it's all said and done, you're probably looking at Djokovic overall. Again, it comes back to, is it just on court that we're taking into consideration here? Because, if we're looking at a more well-rounded, it's a bit like LeBron versus Michael Jordan. Do you take just what's on the court, or are you looking at, what they do for the community and everything? But, I'd say they all have their own strengths. Personally, through me growing up into where I am now, because I missed kind of pre-Federer, I would go Federer just because of what I've seen over a longer period of time. But I think when it's all said and done, you're probably going to, I'm fairly certain that it'll be Djokovic. But if you put that out on Twitter, you will make 1/3 of people very happy and 2/3 of people very unhappy. So I generally don't answer that question.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy how tennis has sort of had 3 generational type male players all at the peak, all fighting each other for the last 10 years. It's mind blowing.